I am Lena Harper, 25 years old, and I live in a rundown neighborhood in Chicago. The kind of place where the buildings are old and crumbling, and the streets are coated in dust and dirt, forgotten by time. The city hums with noise, but it always feels empty here. Every morning, I wake up in my small, cramped room, the walls yellowed with age, and the faint light that filters through the thin curtains does little to brighten the place. The noise from outside is always there, cars honking, people shouting, the city living its fast-paced life while I remain frozen in this tiny space. My room doesn't have much. It's a place to sleep, to rest my body for a few hours before the cycle starts again. My bed is creaky, the mattress thin, but I've long stopped thinking about comfort. I don't have the luxury to focus on things like that anymore. Every morning starts the same. The harsh buzz of the alarm forces me out of bed at 5 a.m. I stumble to the bathroom, rubbing my tired eyes, looking at my reflection in the mirror. My skin is pale, and my eyes are dark, exhausted from the constant lack of sleep. My hair is messy, and my hands are rough, scarred from the work I've done over the years. I don't have time to think about what I look like. I pull on my work clothes, dirty jeans, a grease-stained shirt, and rush out of my room, ready to face another long day. I work at a small auto repair shop in the mornings. The shop is located on a quiet, neglected street, far from the glossy parts of the city. The sign above the door is old, faded, and covered in grease. The air smells like oil, gasoline, and rust. The sound of clanging metal and the whirring of power tools fills the air as I crawl under cars, fixing engines, replacing parts. I've learned to keep my head down and get the job done. No one really notices me here. I'm just the girl in the back, quietly fixing what needs fixing. There's no room for small talk, no time for anything other than work. The men I work with are loud, talking about sports and plans for the weekend, but I don't join in. I'm too tired for that. I can't even remember the last time I had a conversation that didn't revolve around work. My hands are black with grease, my back aches, but I push through it because I have no other choice. By the time the afternoon rolls around, I'm exhausted, but I don't stop. I work at a live music bar at night. The place is just as grimy as the repair shop, with dim lights, peeling paint, and the faint smell of alcohol hanging in the air. The customers are mostly regulars, people looking to forget their problems for a while. The music is loud, a mix of rock and blues, the kind that makes the walls shake and the floor sticky. I stand behind the bar, serving drinks, wiping down counters, listening to the same old stories from the same old people. It's all a blur of empty conversations and clinking glasses. I've learned to shut it all out. I go through the motions, pour a drink, hand it over, smile when necessary, but my mind is somewhere else. My mind is always somewhere else. I don't care about the people who come in, I don't care about the music. All I care about is getting through the night, getting through the next few hours, until I can finally get back to my bed and try to sleep again. There's no glamour in my life, no room for dreams. Some nights, when the bar is quiet and I can finally sit down for a minute, I close my eyes and try to remember what it was like before. Before I became just another face in the crowd, before my world became nothing but work and exhaustion. I think about the dreams I used to have, about leaving this city, about finding something better, about being more than just a person who worked 2 jobs to survive. But those dreams feel so far away now, like they belong to a different person, someone I used to know. I know that I'm stuck in this cycle. I know that if I don't work, I don't eat. If I don't keep moving, I'll sink. But there's a fire inside me that refuses to die. It's a quiet thing, something I don't talk about, but it's there, deep inside, reminding me that I'm still capable of something more. I've been treated like I don't matter, like I'm invisible, but I know I'm not. I'm still here. And one day, when I'm ready, I'll show everyone that I'm not the girl they think I am. I'm more than just a body behind a bar or under a car. I'm not just surviving, I'm going to thrive. It's not about revenge, it's about justice. And I'm going to make sure I get mine, no matter the cost. Every day is a struggle, but I'm learning that sometimes the best revenge isn't about bringing someone down. It's about showing up every day, working harder than anyone else, proving to myself, and to the world, that I'm not just another forgotten soul. I will rise because I have no other choice. I grew up in a family that never had much. We weren't poor in the sense that we were on the brink of homelessness, but we were far from well off. My parents, both hard workers, seemed to barely scrape by, always struggling to pay the bills, but somehow there was always enough for Lucas. Always, even when there wasn't much left for the rest of us. My father, Greg, worked long hours as a mechanic at a local auto shop. My mother, Maggie, worked as a nurse at a nearby hospital. They were both gone most of the time, and I remember the house always feeling empty, like something was missing. I spent most of my childhood taking care of myself, doing my best to fill the gaps. I learned to make my own meals by the time I was 10, to fold my own clothes, and to keep the house in some semblance of order, because no one else was going to do it. But Lucas, my brother, never had to worry about these things. He was their golden boy, the one they always doted on, the one who never had to lift a finger. I remember being 12, working after school at a local diner just to help buy groceries, and seeing Lucas lounging on the couch, playing video games, while our parents brought him snacks and drinks without him even asking. There was no real reason for it, no explanation. He was just their special one. They didn't even try to hide it. Lucas could do whatever he wanted without facing any consequences. He'd mess up his room and they'd clean it for him. He'd skip school and they'd make excuses for him, saying he was just tired or needed a break. Meanwhile, I had to fight for everything. Nothing was ever handed to me. When I was 14, I spent an entire summer working 2 part-time jobs just to save up for a used bicycle, so I could ride to school and not have to rely on the bus. Meanwhile, Lucas was gifted a brand new skateboard, the kind of high-end one that everyone would envy. And when I questioned it, when I said something about how I never got anything like that, my mom just gave me that soft, apologetic smile and told me I was strong enough to manage without it. She said it as though it was some kind of compliment, but it always stung. It wasn't a compliment. It was a reminder that I wasn't as important, that my wants and needs didn't matter the way Lucas's did. The biggest example of this favoritism came when I turned 16. My parents, thrilled to spoil Lucas for his birthday, bought him a brand new dirt bike, one he had begged for months. I, on the other hand, was given a pair of used sneakers and a bus pass for my birthday. It was the same story every year. Lucas got the parties, the presents, the endless encouragement. I got silence, a lot of silence. No one ever asked me what I wanted. They assumed I could do everything on my own. And I did. I had to, but it wasn't fair. I worked all through high school, babysitting, dog walking, whatever odd jobs I could find, just so I could keep up with school supplies, clothes, and eventually tuition for college. My dream was to get into a good art school, something I had worked so hard for. But the reality of my situation was never far behind me. When it came time to apply for college, I got a partial scholarship, but the rest was supposed to come from a family fund that my parents had always promised would be there for me. But when I opened that letter, I found out the truth. They had borrowed the entire fund for Lucas's big startup idea, an app he had dreamed up that went nowhere. He had dropped out of college after 1 semester to become an entrepreneur. Of course, my parents didn't think twice about putting everything they had into his dream. Meanwhile, I was stuck with a pile of student loans and a part-time job just to make ends meet. And the worst part, they didn't even see the problem. They said it was an investment in his future. I was left to fend for myself. No explanation, no apology, just, "You'll be fine, Lena. You've always figured things out on your own." It became clear over the years that I was invisible in my family's eyes. I was the person who would always pick up the slack, who would never ask for help, because they made it very clear that my success or failure didn't matter as much as Lucas's. He was the one they bet on, the one they had hoped for. I was just the one who did all the work. But no one ever saw that. By the time I was 19, I had had enough. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left. I moved out of the house, found a tiny apartment in a rough part of town, and started living on my own. At first, it felt like freedom, but soon the weight of independence set in. It was hard. It was so much harder than I thought it would be, but it was also mine. For the first time, I was in control of my own life, and it felt like a small victory. But that feeling didn't last long. At 23, I was still working 2 jobs, barely scraping by, with no real prospects of a future that wasn't tied to grinding away for someone else. And every time my parents called, it was the same thing. Lucas was doing something else with his latest business idea, and they were supporting him every step of the way. I never once got a call asking how I was doing, unless it was to ask me to help out, or to let me know what Lucas was up to. Their voices, so full of praise for him, would hang in the air, and I'd quietly listen, wishing I could tell them that I was tired of being forgotten, tired of being their afterthought. But I never said anything. Instead, I just kept working. What else could I do? The truth was, I had learned to live without their support. I had to, but deep down, I was furious. Furious that they never saw me, never recognized the hard work I put in every single day. Furious that Lucas never had to fight for anything, that everything was always handed to him on a silver platter. And the anger, the resentment, it festered, buried under a facade of independence and resilience. It burned quietly, always there, never fading, until I reached my breaking point. Because what they didn't know, what they never bothered to understand, was that I was strong. Not because they told me I was, but because I had to be. I wasn't the one who got all the breaks, and I wasn't the one who was told that everything would be okay. But I was the one who kept going, kept fighting. And in the end, that's what would matter, because no one ever counted on me. But I would show them all that I was more than just the forgotten daughter. I was going to make them see. As I sit here, thinking about everything, my mind inevitably drifts back to my childhood. I remember being the kind of kid who always tried to make things happen, tried to be the best I could, because I knew it was the only way I'd ever get noticed. But even when I did well, really well, it was never enough. I was always that kid at the back of the class, the quiet one who sat in the second row, focusing on my work while everyone else carried on. I remember being so proud of that watercolor painting I spent an entire weekend on when I was 7. It was supposed to be for the school art show, something I'd worked on for days, pouring my heart into it. I imagined my parents sitting in the audience, their faces lighting up with pride as they watched me accept that first-place ribbon. But that never happened. The day of the ceremony came, and I stood in front of my painting, smiling nervously at the other kids who were presenting their work. But I noticed my parents weren't there. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for them to walk in, but they never did. Later that day, when I got home, my award wasn't on the mantel like I had imagined. Instead, it was left in a drawer somewhere, barely even acknowledged. Meanwhile, Lucas, my younger brother, was sitting in front of the TV, eating snacks, watching a game. He had just come back from a little league game that day, and my parents were already showering him with praise, congratulating him on his team's win. When I mentioned how disappointed I was, my mom patted my hand and said, "It's okay, Lena. You're so independent. You don't need all that attention." She didn't even look at me as she spoke. It was like my efforts, my work, hadn't even been seen. But Lucas didn't need to try that hard. He didn't even have to do much to get noticed, and yet, every single time, the attention was all on him. The celebration was all for him. As the years went by, I started noticing the pattern. When I hit 12, it wasn't just the school projects that were ignored, it was everything. I could bring home straight A's and it barely made a difference. But Lucas, he could fail a test and still get a pat on the back and a better luck next time speech. I remember when I made the school volleyball team. I had worked so hard, practicing every afternoon, staying late to perfect my serve. I was so proud of myself when I made the cut. I imagined my parents would show up to my first game, cheer me on, and make me feel like I was doing something special. But they didn't come. Instead, they went to Lucas's basketball game, which I had no interest in. He didn't even care much about it. He didn't practice. He barely tried, But my parents, once again, were there, cheering him on like he was the greatest thing to ever step on the court. When I tried to express how it hurt, how much it made me feel invisible, they'd dismiss it. "Lucas needs us, Lena. He's just a boy. They have it harder, you know." My mother would say, brushing off my feelings with a calmness that only added to my frustration. It was as if I had to prove my worth constantly, while Lucas could just show up and be loved for simply existing. And the birthdays. That's where the gap really widened. I can remember when I was 14. I spent the entire day in my room, decorating it and setting up for a small, quiet birthday dinner, just the three of us. But when Lucas's birthday came around 6 months later, it was a huge party with all his friends. Hired entertainers, a magician, a custom cake. It was like night and day. When I asked my mom why mine was so different, she gave me that same, tired excuse. "You're so independent, Lena. You don't need all that fuss." That was the story of my life. Doing everything on my own because I didn't matter enough to be spoiled, to be celebrated. Even in high school, it was the same. I maintained a 4 GPA while working part-time to help pay for school supplies. I tried my best to excel, to make something of myself, hoping that one day they'd see me. But the only thing they ever really saw was Lucas. He was given everything he wanted. Money, freedom, opportunities, all because he was the baby, the one who could do no wrong. The day I found out they used my college fund for Lucas's first failed business venture was the last straw. I had worked my ass off for years, earning every penny I could just to get into art school. My dream was to attend a prestigious program for graphic design, but when the acceptance letters came, there was nothing left in the fund they'd promised me. I found out my parents had emptied it to support Lucas's great idea of an app, something that never even made it off the ground. And when I asked them why they didn't tell me, why they hadn't been honest, my dad just shrugged and said, "We believe in Lucas. You can always find another way to pay for school. You're smart, Lena, you'll figure it out." That was it. There was no apology, no understanding, just more of the same. Lucas, who had no real plan, getting everything, while I was left to pick up the pieces on my own. It became clear that nothing I did, nothing I achieved, was ever going to matter as much as Lucas's failures. I had spent so many years trying to prove myself, but all I really wanted was for them to notice me, for them to finally see that I was more than just their independent daughter who could take care of herself. But in their eyes, that was all I ever needed to be. Independent. It hurt. It still does if I'm being honest. But over time, I learned to stop asking for their approval. I stopped hoping they would suddenly change. Instead, I decided to make my own way, because in the end, that's all I had ever really been given the chance to do. There was always this feeling, deep down, that I was the one left behind. In my family, I was the forgotten one, the afterthought. Growing up, it felt like Lucas had everything handed to him. The support, the encouragement, the resources to build something, to chase his dreams. Meanwhile, I was the one left to figure everything out on my own. It wasn't just the birthday parties or the new toys that Lucas got. It was the life he was allowed to live. While he spent his time deciding which startup he wanted to try next or playing video games, I spent mine at the kitchen table, balancing bills, looking for ways to make money just to get through the month. I never wanted to feel sorry for myself, but it was hard not to. My parents never saw it, never saw how badly I needed them. They never saw how I struggled to pay for school supplies, how I worked late into the night at my part-time jobs, trying to save up for something more. I kept telling myself that I would be fine on my own, that I was strong enough to handle it. But the truth was, it hurt. It hurt to see Lucas get everything he asked for while I had to scrape and fight for every penny. What hurt even more was that they didn't even try to hide it. They didn't even care to pretend. My parents just assumed I'd be okay, that I didn't need anything. Because I was independent, right? I didn't need help. At least, that's what they told me every time I tried to ask for anything more than what I was already doing. I remember asking my dad once, when I was 17, if he could help me get some art supplies for school, something that could really help with my dream of going to college. He looked at me and said, "You don't need that stuff, Lena. You're resourceful, you can figure it out." But when Lucas wanted a new laptop for his business, they didn't even bat an eye. It was always, "Of course, sweetie. Anything you need." I was forced to find my own way. I worked at the local diner after school, picking up shifts on weekends, doing whatever I could to earn just a little bit of money. By the time I was 18, I was already juggling 2 jobs, one at the diner, another at a coffee shop. I wasn't just doing this to save up for the things I wanted, I was doing it to survive. To pay for gas, food, and most importantly, for my college tuition. Every night, I'd collapse into bed, too tired to think about anything other than the next day's grind. But I kept pushing. I didn't have a choice. The hardest part came when I applied for college. My dream was to go to art school, to get into a design program and make something of myself. But when the acceptance letter arrived, I was crushed. It was a partial scholarship, not nearly enough to cover everything. For years, my parents had told me about this college fund they had set aside for me. They said it would be there when I needed it. But when I went to check, the money was gone. I found out they had used it all to fund Lucas's big idea, his startup app that failed before it even got off the ground. I remember the feeling of betrayal so clearly. I called my mom, barely holding it together, asking her what happened. She told me almost nonchalantly, "We thought Lucas needed it more, Lena. His business was going to take off. You'll figure it out, you're smart. You've always been resourceful." Those words, "you'll figure it out," were like a punch to the gut. Lucas's business venture failed. Yet here I was, scrambling to find a way to pay for my future, while my brother was off gallivanting around, starting over again and again with his failed ideas, all of them funded by my parents. It was like I didn't even exist in their eyes. My dreams, my struggles, they were invisible. The truth was, I had been pushed aside. I was always expected to handle things myself, to figure everything out without anyone's help. My parents saw me as self-sufficient, as someone who didn't need anything. But that wasn't the reality. I needed them. I needed their support, especially when it came to something as crucial as my education. Instead, I was left to shoulder it all alone while Lucas got everything he ever wanted. In those moments, the anger bubbled up. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the emotional neglect, the feeling of being constantly overshadowed, the sense that no matter what I did, I would never be good enough in their eyes. I began to resent the fact that Lucas could do no wrong in their eyes, and I was the one who had to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. But I kept going. I had no choice. The more they ignored me, the harder I worked. Every shift, every hour, every paycheck, it was all to prove them wrong. To prove that I didn't need them to succeed. I didn't need their money or their praise. I would make my own way. And when I finally succeeded, when I finally made something of myself, it wouldn't be because of them, it would be despite them. And that would be my revenge. The most painful thing was that, deep down, I had always wanted their love. I had wanted them to be proud of me, to acknowledge the sacrifices I had made. I wanted to be seen, not just as the person who could handle it, but as someone who mattered. But they never saw me that way. So, I made the decision to stop needing their approval. I didn't need them to validate me anymore. I would create my own validation, my own success. And that would be the moment when they would finally understand just how much I had been carrying on my own. It was another late night at the bar, one of those shifts that dragged on longer than I wanted. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the sound of clinking glasses drowned out by the pulse of the music in the background. I was used to the buzz of the place by now, used to moving through the crowd, ignoring the comments from drunk patrons, the leering eyes, and the stale smell of cheap whiskey that lingered on my clothes long after I left. Every shift felt like I was slipping further into the anonymity of this place, becoming part of the backdrop of a life that never seemed to change. But then, that night, something changed. It was toward the end of my shift when I first saw him. I was wiping down the counter, barely paying attention to the faces around me, when a voice pulled me out of my haze. "Lena Harper, is that really you?" I turned, wiping the rag across the bar, thinking maybe I had misheard. But then I saw him standing there, Uncle Marcus. I froze. The world seemed to stop for a moment, the noise around me fading as I processed the sight of him. Uncle Marcus. I hadn't seen him in years. It felt like a lifetime ago when he had disappeared from our lives, right after that huge falling out with my dad. No one in the family ever talked about it, but I remember the tension, the raised voices, the slammed doors. I was just a teenager at the time, and at that age, you don't really understand why things fall apart between adults. All I knew was that my dad was angry, furious, really, and one day Marcus just vanished. He had been a successful investor back then, always talking about big deals, huge companies, and the kind of wealth that felt untouchable. But after that incident with my father, he was gone, and the whole family just turned their backs on him. We never spoke of him again, not once. Now here he was, standing in front of me looking different. More mature, of course, but not just that. There was something in his eyes, something more settled, more confident. He looked successful. In a way I hadn't imagined. The years hadn't been kind to the rest of us, but Marcus, he had thrived. His suit alone screamed wealth, but it wasn't the kind of wealth that was flashy. It was understated, elegant. The kind of wealth that felt earned, not inherited. For a moment, I just stood there, unable to form words. Then he smiled, genuine, warm, and that broke the silence. I knew it was you the moment I saw you. You look just like your father, he said, his voice calm but filled with surprise and recognition. I laughed awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. Yeah, well, I guess we all have our own paths, right? I said, still a little in shock. Marcus took a seat at the bar, his eyes still studying me with a kind of intensity I wasn't used to. It's been a long time, Lena. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I should have kept in touch. But seeing you here, this isn't what I imagined for you. His words struck me harder than I expected. This isn't what I imagined for you. It was a small thing, a passing comment, but it felt like he saw me. Like he saw the real me, not the independent daughter my parents always thought I was. For a split second, I felt something inside me soften, a flicker of hope, of validation that I hadn't realized I needed. But before I could dwell on it, he spoke again. You've got potential, Lena. You always did. And I'm not just saying that because you're my niece. I've been watching you. You've got something special. I run a startup now, it's in tech, and we're building something big. I could use someone like you, someone with drive. You don't belong here, not forever. You're smarter than that. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone like me, smart enough for his company. It felt like a dream. I thought he was just being kind, trying to console me, but when I looked at his face, I saw sincerity. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen me as more than just a survivor, more than just the girl who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. You're serious? I asked, almost hesitant to believe it. I was still trying to process everything. This wasn't the kind of opportunity that came knocking on your door every day. I'm very serious, he replied, his voice steady. You're not going to get where you want to go by staying stuck in this rut. I have a place for you, Lena, and I think you'll find that you can do more than just scrape by. You've always had the talent. Now, I want to help you make something of it. The offer hung in the air, heavy and real. I could feel the weight of it. Here was this man who had disappeared from our family, who had built an empire from nothing, offering me a chance. A chance to leave this life behind, to walk away from the late nights, the exhaustion, the feeling of being stuck. It was almost too good to be true. But as I stood there, looking at him, something inside me clicked. I had been waiting for this, for someone to see beyond the tired, overworked version of myself that my family had left me to become. I'll think about it, I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. I wasn't ready to jump into anything, not yet. I had too many questions, too many doubts. But for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the life I had been living. Marcus smiled, sensing my hesitation but also understanding. Take your time, he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a sleek business card. Here's my number. Call me when you're ready. But know this, Lena, you've got more in you than you realize. You don't need to be stuck in this place forever. I took the card from him, my fingers lingering on the edge of it. My heart was racing, but there was a part of me that wanted to believe him, that wanted to trust in this unexpected lifeline he was offering. That night, as I went home, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. It wasn't just the idea of a job, it was the possibility of something bigger. A life where I could finally make a name for myself, where I wouldn't have to fight every single day just to survive. A life where I could finally stop being the person no one noticed. The next morning, I woke up early, stared at the business card in my hand, and realized something. It wasn't just Marcus offering me a chance. It was myself giving me the opportunity I had been waiting for. The opportunity to stop being invisible, to step out of the shadow of my family, and finally take control of my own future. And I knew, right then, that I wasn't going to let this slip away. I spent the next few days thinking about Marcus's offer. At first, I couldn't quite believe it. Who was I, really, to be given a chance like that? To walk away from everything I had known, the late-night shifts, the exhaustion, the constant battle to stay afloat, and step into a world that seemed completely out of reach. It felt like a dream, something too good to be true. And deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that maybe I wasn't cut out for this new life, that I would fail and end up with nothing. But the reality was hard to ignore. My bank account was nearly empty, my bills piling up. The money I made from my 2 jobs barely covered rent, let alone anything else. I hadn't been able to afford a decent meal in weeks, and I had no idea how I was going to pay for my next semester of college. I was drowning and there was no lifeline in sight. So, after days of trying to talk myself out of it, I finally made the decision. I picked up the phone and I called Marcus. "I'm in," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll join the company." It wasn't the easiest decision, but I knew I had no other choice. The fear of failure was nothing compared to the fear of being stuck in this dead-end life forever. So I packed up my things, said goodbye to the bar, and walked away. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a shot at something bigger. But the excitement of the new opportunity didn't last long. The deeper I got into the company, the more I started to feel like something was off. Marcus had promised me a chance to thrive, to grow, and at first, that's exactly what it felt like. He gave me tasks that challenged me, pushed me to be better, and praised my work when it was good. But there was something else underneath the surface, something I couldn't quite place. I began to notice the subtle hints of tension when Marcus would talk about my family. It wasn't just casual conversation. It was like he was planting seeds, making little comments that made me uncomfortable. "Your parents never supported you the way they should have, Lena," he'd say. Or, "I know how it feels to be overlooked in a family that only sees what they want to see." At first, I thought it was just a passing remark. But then, it happened again and again. And that's when I started to realize the truth. Marcus wasn't offering me a chance because he genuinely believed in me. He wasn't giving me an opportunity to succeed because he thought I had potential. He was using me as a pawn in his own twisted game of revenge against my family. The more I dug into the company, the more I uncovered. It turned out that Marcus's venture wasn't just about business, it was personal. He had been building this company not only as a way to make money, but as a way to get back at my parents for what he saw as their betrayal. He wanted them to see their mistakes, to watch me succeed, and force them to face the truth of how they had treated me. It was like every step I took, every milestone I achieved, was another stone in his plan to break down the walls of their arrogance and pride. The worst part, I was a part of it. I was helping him, unknowingly, to execute a plan that involved me being at the center of it all. The more I thought about it, the more disgusted I felt. Marcus was playing a dangerous game, and I was the chess piece. One day, after a particularly grueling meeting, I sat in my office, staring at my computer screen, trying to digest everything I had learned. The truth hit me hard, like a ton of bricks. The company was built on lies, on manipulation, and on the hope that by making me successful, Marcus could force my family to admit their wrongs. It was a cruel, twisted revenge, one that I had unknowingly become a part of. I wasn't just joining a startup. I wasn't just building a career. I was being used as a weapon in someone else's war, but there was a part of me that couldn't let go. There was a part of me that still wanted to make my family see me, still wanted to show them that I was more than they ever gave me credit for. I didn't want to be the forgotten daughter anymore. I didn't want to be overlooked and underappreciated. And I realized, for all of Marcus's manipulation, there was still a part of me that wanted to see my family confront the way they had treated me. The decision wasn't easy. I couldn't just walk away from everything I had worked for, from the life I was beginning to build. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that the only way to break free of the chains Marcus had placed on me was to confront him, and my family, on my own terms. I wasn't going to be a pawn in his game anymore. I would find my own way to show my family the truth, and if that meant risking everything I had just gained, then so be it. I walked into Marcus's startup with a mix of anticipation and dread. The glossy, open-concept office with its sleek furniture and glass-walled conference rooms felt like a dream, a world I had never thought I'd belong to. But as soon as I took my seat at my new desk, the reality of the situation hit me. The startup was in crisis mode. There were no grand introductions, no handshakes, no team-building exercises. Just a group of overworked, underpaid employees hunched over their desks, glued to their screens, their faces strained with stress. I'd heard Marcus talk about how promising the company was, how it was a beacon of innovation in the tech world. But the truth was much darker. The company was struggling. Money was tight, investors were starting to pull out, and deadlines were constantly slipping. The pressure was palpable. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, like a weight on my chest. Every conversation I overheard seemed to center on one thing: survival. Marcus had given me a chance, but he hadn't prepared me for what that would actually look like. The first few days were a blur of meetings, constant emails, and long hours. I was thrown straight into the deep end. My tasks were daunting: creating marketing strategies, designing presentations, and trying to help build a product that no one was sure anyone even wanted. Everyone here was scrambling, trying to keep their heads above water, and I was no exception. I felt like I was drowning. Every project I worked on seemed to fail at some level. I couldn't meet the high expectations that had been set, and the more I struggled, the more it became clear that this place wasn't interested in mistakes. This was sink or swim, and it felt like I was constantly treading water. I could feel the judgment of my colleagues, even when they weren't speaking directly to me. They saw me as the newbie, the outsider, the one who had been brought in because of some personal connection. I wasn't just trying to prove myself to Marcus anymore. I was trying to prove to everyone here that I deserved to be here, that I wasn't just a pawn in someone's revenge plot. I spent sleepless nights reworking designs, brainstorming new ideas, and revising every presentation until I couldn't see straight. But the harder I worked, the more the fear of failure consumed me. The company's future was teetering on the edge, and so was mine. If I didn't succeed here, I'd be just like everyone else, another person Marcus had used to make a point, then discarded when they didn't live up to expectations. The pressure mounted with each passing day. I'd never felt like this before. It was one thing to work hard for something, to chase a dream, but this felt like a constant battle against time and the growing realization that I might not be good enough. I wasn't just fighting for success anymore. I was fighting for survival, but something changed in me. I started to realize that I wasn't just here to prove myself to Marcus or to anyone else. I was here because I had earned it. It wasn't just about getting through the day anymore. It was about showing up every day and fighting through the fear. It was about facing the challenges instead of running from them. There was one particular moment that made everything click for me. It was a late night, the office almost empty except for a few of us, and I was working on a major presentation for a new potential investor. The pressure was on, and I could feel it squeezing me from all sides. The task was daunting, and I felt myself faltering. But then, in the quiet, I heard Marcus's voice in the hallway. He walked in, as usual, calm and collected, as if everything was under control. He sat down across from me, watching me work for a few moments before speaking. "You're struggling," he said simply. I didn't know how to respond. How could I admit that everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers? "I am," I said quietly, unable to hide the exhaustion in my voice. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You've got potential, Lena. You've always had it. But you need to stop waiting for someone to hand you success. You need to take it. There are no shortcuts in this world, especially not in this company. You have to be willing to sink or swim on your own." I sat there, watching the scene unfold in front of me, and I couldn't help but think about everything that had led to this moment. The money, the constant support, the endless opportunities, all of it had led Lucas to this point. Failure. And now, just like me, he was faced with the consequences of choices he had made. But unlike me, Lucas had always been shielded from the worst of it. He had never been forced to fight the way I had, to claw his way out of the messes he had created. But the truth was, I felt no sympathy for him. I had spent my entire life watching Lucas get away with everything, while I struggled to keep my head above water. Now, the tables were turning, and for once, it wasn't me being blamed for everything. As I listened to the heated arguments between my parents and Lucas that night, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. I had spent years being the one left behind, the one forgotten and overlooked. But now, I saw Lucas facing the same reality I had to deal with for so long. I wasn't happy about his failure, but I couldn't deny the bitter satisfaction I felt. For once, the world was seeing Lucas for what he really was. The family that had always prioritized him over me was finally facing the harsh truth that no amount of money or support could fix the mistakes he had made. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible anymore. The night after the argument, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I could hear the muffled sounds of my parents talking downstairs, their voices quiet, but their worry evident. They were trying to figure out how to bail Lucas out once again. As I lay there, I kept turning their words over and over in my mind. My mother's soft tone, my father's defensive response, and Lucas's desperation filled my thoughts. It was the same old story. Lucas had failed yet again, and now my parents were scrambling to save him, to fix his mistakes, just as they always had. They never once let him fall hard enough to learn. They never let him fail. But I had failed. Over and over, I had failed and struggled, alone, without a safety net. I had worked tirelessly to carve my own way, to make something of myself, because I was never given the luxury of a second chance. And now, here they were, asking me to save Lucas from the consequences of his own choices. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to step in and bail him out, to give them the money they needed to save his business, just like they had done for years. But I wasn't going to do it. I couldn't. For the first time in my life, I decided to let them face the truth. They needed to see. They needed to understand that the way they had been enabling Lucas for so long wasn't helping him. It was only making things worse. By constantly swooping in to rescue him, they had ensured that he never learned how to stand on his own. They had given him the freedom to fail without the consequences, and now, they were reaping what they had sown. I could hear my mother's voice in my head, the way she always spoke so lovingly of Lucas, telling me that he needed help because boys have it harder, that he needed more chances. But I wasn't going to let that excuse stand anymore. Lucas had always been treated like the golden child, while I had been the one expected to fend for myself. Now that he was facing the reality of his choices, I wasn't going to step in and fix it for him. He had to learn. They had to learn. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from my dad. It was simple, just a few words. "Lena, we need to talk. Lucas is in trouble, please help." I sat there, staring at the screen, my finger hovering over the reply button. It would have been so easy to send the money. To just help them out, like I had always done when I was younger, like they had always expected me to. But I couldn't. Not this time. I had come to a hard realization over the past few days. Lucas had never been forced to face the consequences of his actions, and it was time for him to do so. It was time for him to understand what it meant to be responsible for his own choices. I wasn't going to be the safety net that my parents kept throwing him. He had to learn how to fall and then how to pick himself up. Just like I had to, I didn't reply to the message right away. Instead, I thought long and hard about what I needed to say. When I finally did respond, I told them the truth. I'm sorry, but I can't help. Lucas needs to learn how to stand on his own. You've given him everything, and he's never had to face the consequences. He needs to figure this out himself, just like I've had to. I can't keep fixing things for him. It's time for him to grow up. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but also like a door had slammed shut. I knew what this would mean for my relationship with my parents. They would be angry, hurt, and confused. They would think I was being cold or unsympathetic. But they had to understand. They had to realize that their approach had only created a cycle of dependence in Lucas's life, and if they didn't see that now, they would never learn. As much as it broke my heart, I knew this was the right decision. It wasn't about punishing him or hurting them, it was about breaking the cycle. It was about letting them face the consequences of their own choices. For so long, I had been the one forced to stand on my own. I had to fight, struggle, and scrape for everything I had. And I wasn't about to let Lucas skip that step, no matter how painful it might be. The next few weeks were filled with tension. My parents didn't reach out much after my message. When they did, it was with words laced with frustration and disappointment. But I didn't back down. I kept reminding myself that this was the only way for them to see how they had been enabling Lucas. It was the only way for him to truly understand what it meant to fail and how to pick himself back up again. I didn't know how long it would take or whether my parents would ever understand my decision. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep carrying them. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of their expectations. It was time for me to live for myself, to make my own choices, and to not feel guilty about it. The tension had been building for days, maybe even weeks. I could feel it hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. My parents had stopped calling as often, and when they did, it was always the same. Questions about Lucas, how he was doing, what he needed when they could help him again. They didn't even try to hide it anymore. And me. Well, I was still the invisible daughter, the one they thought didn't need anything, didn't need them. I had spent enough time being angry, enough time letting the resentment fester inside me. But now, it was time for confrontation. It was time to finally make them see. To make them understand the depth of what they had done, not just to Lucas, but to me. That afternoon, I called them. My heart was racing, but I knew what I had to do. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. Mom, Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to talk to you. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before my mom finally spoke. What is it, Lena? Is everything okay? Everything is fine, I said, though I knew it wasn't. But we need to talk about Lucas. About the way you've been treating him, the way you've treated me. A silence. It was always the silence that came first, the hesitation. It was like they were bracing themselves for what was coming, but they didn't know how to respond. We've already talked about Lucas. My father's voice finally broke through, his tone defensive. He's just having a rough patch. It's not easy trying to run a business, and he needs our support. You know that. I know, I said, my voice firm, my heart pounding. But it's more than just this business, Dad. You've been enabling him for years, and you've never let him face the consequences of his actions. You've shielded him from everything, and now you're doing it again. You're throwing money at his problems instead of letting him learn from his mistakes. There was a heavy sigh from my mom. Lena, you don't understand. He's our son. We're just trying to help him, to give him what he needs. I could feel the old, familiar frustration bubbling up in me. They had said the same things to me, year after year, as they let Lucas get away with everything while I was left to fight for myself. But this time, I wasn't backing down. No, I said, my voice cutting through the phone like a knife. That's not how it works. You think that by always rescuing him, you're helping him, but you're not, you're enabling him. You've made him dependent on you, and now he doesn't know how to stand on his own. And that's not his fault, it's yours. The silence was thick on the other end. I could almost hear them grappling with the weight of my words. My dad's sigh was deep this time, full of regret, but also pride, a pride that I had never received. I could almost feel the shift as he realized that, for once, I wasn't the one he could ignore. We've always tried to make things easier for you, Lena, my mom finally said, her voice soft but laced with that same tired excuse. You've always been so strong. You never needed us the way Lucas does. No, I replied, taking a deep breath. That's exactly the point. You never needed me. You gave Lucas everything he wanted, but when it came to me, I was just expected to figure it out. You never took me seriously. You never celebrated my successes the way you did his. I spent my whole life trying to prove that I could stand on my own, but I never asked for that. I never wanted to be treated like I didn't matter. The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I could feel the weight of them, and I knew my parents could, too. This wasn't just about Lucas anymore. This was about me finally taking back my voice, my space in this family. I've spent years fighting for your attention, I continued, my voice trembling with emotion but steady with resolve. And every time I succeeded, it was like you didn't even notice. Every time I needed you, you were too busy holding Lucas's hand, making sure he didn't fail, making sure everything was easy for him. But what about me? What about the fact that I was the one who had to work 2 jobs just to get by? What about the fact that I had to make my own way, because you never bothered to help me? There was another long silence. My parents didn't know how to respond. They had never been forced to hear this before. They had never been confronted with the truth of their behavior. I didn't want to be the strong one, Mom, I said, my voice quieter now, but with a clarity that felt almost freeing. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to matter. But every time I asked for help, you just brushed me off. And now you want me to bail Lucas out. You want me to give him the money he needs to keep going. No, I'm not doing it, not this time. He needs to learn how to stand on his own, just like I did. There was no immediate response. For the first time, I could hear the truth in the silence. My parents were faced with something they had always avoided, the consequences of their actions. The truth was out there now, and I wasn't going to hide from it anymore. I'm done playing this role, I said, my voice strong, even if my heart was still pounding in my chest. I've spent my whole life being the one who had to make things work on my own, while Lucas got everything handed to him. You need to stop enabling him, and you need to own up to how you've treated me. Because I'm not going to keep being the afterthought in this family. The days blurred into weeks, and somewhere along the way, I stopped questioning whether I was capable of succeeding. The uncertainty that had once been a constant companion began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that I hadn't felt in years. Marcus, for all his manipulations and hidden motives, had become more than just a mentor. He had pushed me, sharpened me, and taught me to see beyond my own self-doubt. His advice, though laced with his own agendas, had given me the tools to transform my skills into something invaluable. I started to make waves in the company. My ideas were being noticed, my designs were more refined, and my presentations began to stand out. Marcus might have had his eyes on bigger goals, but for me, it was personal. Every project I took on, every task I accomplished, felt like a small victory in the war I had been fighting for so long, the war to finally be seen. And it wasn't just about the work. For the first time, I was building my own reputation. People at the company began to recognize my contributions. I wasn't the quiet girl who had been brought in on the strength of a family name. I was Lena, the designer with ideas, with vision. I was carving out my own place in this world, not as a favor to Marcus or anyone else, but because I had earned it. By the time the company secured its first major client, I had risen to a position of real influence. I was leading teams, making decisions that affected the direction of the projects. I had earned the trust of my colleagues, And most importantly, I had earned my own trust. Then came the offer I had never expected. I remember sitting in my office one afternoon, scrolling through emails, when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered hesitantly, expecting some issue with a project or a new request from Marcus. But instead, I was met with a voice I recognized immediately. "Lena, this is Jake Miller from Stratos Tech. I've been following your work for some time now, and I'm impressed with what you've done. We'd love to have you on board as a lead designer. I think you'd be a great fit for the team." Stratos Tech. The name alone was enough to make my heart skip a beat. It was one of the leading tech firms in the industry, a company I had admired from afar, knowing I didn't have the kind of connections to even get a foot in the door. Jake continued, "We're expanding our design department, and we believe you could really bring something fresh to the table. We're offering you a position that comes with a competitive salary and the opportunity to lead a much larger team. What do you think?" The words felt surreal. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the offer that had just been extended to me. This wasn't just a job offer, it was a new beginning. For a moment, I thought about Marcus. I thought about how he had taken me under his wing, about all the late nights and the moments when I had felt so small, so unsure of myself. But I had grown. Marcus had helped shape me, but I had learned to stand on my own. And now, this was my chance to break free from everything. To move beyond Marcus, beyond the shadow of my family's expectations, and take a step into the world on my own terms. I wasn't going to let anyone hold me back anymore. I called Marcus that night, my fingers shaking slightly as I dialed his number. I knew what he would say when I told him about the offer. He would probably act pleased, offer congratulations, but somewhere beneath the surface, I knew there would be a flicker of resentment. After all, I had become more than just a tool in his game. I had become my own person. "Marcus," I said when he picked up, "I've been offered a position at Stratos Tech. I think I'm going to take it." There was a pause, longer than I expected, before he responded. "Stratos Tech, that's a big move, Lena, but I get it. You've outgrown this place. I always knew you had it in you." His voice sounded sincere enough, but I could hear the underlying tension in his words. He hadn't expected this. And I realized, in that moment, that for all his mentoring, for all his promises, Marcus had always seen me as part of his plan. But now, I was walking away from it. I was stepping out of his game, creating my own future. "I think it's time," I said, my voice more confident than I had ever heard it before. "Time for me to move on. I need to build something for myself, not just for someone else." There was no immediate response from Marcus. I could almost hear him processing it, but I didn't need him to approve of my decision. I had already made it. The next few days were a whirlwind. I met with the team at Stratos Tech, signed the contract, and started planning my transition. The excitement was overwhelming, but beneath it, I felt a deep sense of relief. I was finally leaving behind the version of myself that had been defined by others, by my family's expectations, by Marcus's plan, by all the years I had spent fighting for recognition. Weeks passed after my decision to move on. The excitement of my new role at Stratos Tech felt like a dream, but there was always a lingering part of me, a part that had been ignored for so long, that kept wondering what would happen to Lucas. The tension between us had been building for months. The last time I had seen him, things were raw. He was frustrated, confused, and desperate. I had made my choice, and he had to face the consequences of his actions. The money wasn't coming from me, and it wasn't going to come from my parents anymore. They had finally realized that they couldn't keep rescuing him, just as I had realized that I couldn't keep stepping in to fix everything for him. But then, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I got a call from my mom. It wasn't unusual for her to check in, but there was a strange undertone to her voice this time, one that felt different from the usual concerns about Lucas's business. "Lena, have you heard from Lucas recently?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "Not much," I replied, a bit guarded. "Why?" "Well," she hesitated, "he's been trying to figure things out on his own. He's looking for a job." I felt a jolt of surprise run through me. Lucas, looking for a job, the same Lucas who had always been handed everything, who had never been forced to face real failure. I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride for him, but also a sense of skepticism. Had he really changed? You mean he's actually going to work for someone else? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Yes, my mom continued, her voice tinged with something between relief and disbelief. He's been applying to a few places. I don't know if it's the right move, but I think he finally understands. He's stopped asking for money, Lena. He's trying to make it on his own. I didn't know what to say. This was the first real sign of change in Lucas that I had seen in years. It felt like the world had shifted somehow, like maybe he had finally started to realize that life wasn't just about trying to make the next big thing happen without consequences. The next few days were full of small updates from my mom. Lucas had been going to interviews, revising his resume, trying to get his foot in the door with several companies. It was all happening so fast that I barely had time to process it. I couldn't believe that the boy who had always been the golden child, the one who never had to struggle, was now putting in the work. The hard work. The kind of work I had always done. Finally, one evening I received a text from him. It was short, but the weight of it was impossible to ignore. I got a job. It's not much, but it's a start. I just wanted to say thanks for not helping me out. You were right. I needed to figure it out myself. I stared at the text for what felt like hours, processing the words. Lucas had acknowledged it. He had finally seen. The years of me trying to get him to understand the value of hard work, of standing on his own 2 feet, had finally broken through. And somehow, this small acknowledgement from him felt like a massive victory. The next time I saw Lucas, a few weeks later, he looked different. There was a quiet confidence in his posture, a sense of responsibility in the way he spoke. His face was less stressed, more at peace. He was still trying to figure things out, still struggling, but the difference was clear. He was doing it himself. No more relying on our parents. No more expecting someone to bail him out. You were right, Lucas said, his voice sincere for the first time in a long time. I thought I could just ride on other people's support forever. But I can't. I can't keep doing that. I have to stand on my own. I nodded, not knowing what to say. There was so much I had wanted him to understand, so much anger I had held onto for years. But in that moment, all of that seemed to fall away. Maybe it was time to let go. You'll be okay, I said softly, finally allowing myself to believe it. You're doing the right thing. Lucas smiled, a real smile. It wasn't the smirk or the defensiveness I had grown so used to seeing. It was genuine. And in that moment, I realized that, while our paths had been so different, we were both finally starting to find our way. We weren't the people we had been before. For the first time, I saw my brother, really saw him, not as the one who was always laid out, but as someone who was beginning to take responsibility. It wasn't perfect, and I knew it wouldn't be easy for him. But for the first time, I believed Lucas had finally learned what I had learned years ago, that real success came not from being handed everything, but from working for it, from standing up after you've fallen. And that's when I knew he would be all right. As I sit here now, in the comfort of my new life and a career I've built from the ground up, I can't help but reflect on how far I've come. Looking back at everything, the struggles, the setbacks, and the long years of feeling invisible, I can finally see the truth. Life, it turns out, isn't always fair. I spent so many years fighting against the unfairness of it all. My family's favoritism, Lucas's constant need for help, and the feeling that I was never quite enough. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I questioned everything. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when I wanted to collapse under the weight of all the expectations, both from others and from myself. But in the end, it was those struggles that shaped me, that forced me to grow. I've realized something important along the way. Self-reliance is not just about surviving, it's about thriving on your own terms. The world may not always hand you the opportunities you deserve. It may not always give you a fair shot, and sometimes it will make you feel small, insignificant. But the key is not letting that define you. It's not about what others think of you, it's about what you believe about yourself. There were times when I felt lost, when I doubted my own worth, and I was tempted to fall back into the shadows of my family's expectations. But every step I took, every struggle I faced, I learned that the only way to truly rise above it all was to trust myself. To keep going, even when everything seemed stacked against me. And here's the thing, the greatest revenge, the most powerful statement you can make, isn't about tearing others down, isn't about winning over them. The real victory lies in proving your worth to yourself. It lies in standing tall and showing that, despite everything you've been through, you can still achieve, you can still grow, and you can still succeed. It wasn't about tearing down my family, about making them regret their decisions. The truth is, they may never understand everything I've been through or why I did what I did, but I don't need their validation anymore. What matters is that I've learned to validate myself, and that, in itself, is the greatest triumph of all. So to anyone out there who's struggling, who feels like they're stuck in a cycle they can't break free from, I want you to hear this. The hardships you face, the unfairness, the setbacks, they don't define you. What defines you is how you rise above them. What defines you is the strength you find within yourself when the world seems to want you to fall. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for anyone to give you the green light to succeed. You are the author of your own story. Write it on your own terms, and don't let anyone take that from you. In the end, the true measure of success isn't how much you've accumulated or how high you've climbed. It's in the person you've become along the way. And I've become someone I'm proud of.